Hi, welcome to Relish Books. This is the last part in my three-part MacDonald, Lewis, and Tolkien series, looking at the different styles of these authors from very metaphorical to very reality-based fiction, and whose method I think is really the most effective, and some disagreements the authors had, and who I really think is the most right. So we started with MacDonald, who was so heavily metaphorical, and then moved on to Lewis, who was also very metaphorical, but a more clear and pointed metaphor. And then Tolkien, who claims to not be metaphorical at all. And a lot of people still see so much meaning in his books. They have a really hard time believing that he wasn't intentionally using metaphor from all kinds of different things in his life. And the thing is, I don't think that people are necessarily wrong, but I also think that Tolkien's telling the truth. I think these things in his life couldn't help but play into his storytelling in some ways, even if he wasn't aware of it. But I mean, he was still the one making this stuff up, and I think whenever your imagination is always going to be influenced by your life. And that is really what I want to talk about when it comes to Tolkien. It's intimidating trying to talk about the Lord of the Rings. They're so huge. I don't think they should be considered just fantasy or high fantasy, but truly one of the great classics. And so many people have already talked about that. So I'm not really going to break down the story much at all. I think most everybody is going to be pretty well acquainted with it. Have here these very beautiful leather-bound copies. But the reason I think Tolkien is the greatest of these three writers when it comes to fiction is because he wasn't approaching fiction as a tool. C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald and Tolkien were all very religious men. And George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis really tried to use their writings to reach people and convince people of their faith or their different religious ideas or theories or beliefs. And while there's not really anything wrong with that, I think when it comes to fiction, though, Tolkien's was the most effective because he approached fiction not as a tool, but as an art form. And I'm not saying the other guys didn't either, but they were definitely trying to use the art form for their own means. And again, I'm not really saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think that approach is going to be less effective because people see that and sense that, and it's not as appealing, and it's also just usually not as pure and good fiction. So Tolkien, he claims to not put any metaphor or like a pointed moral to his stories. They're just stories for the sake of stories. He loved his stories. He loved his characters. He loved his world. He was a perfectionist. Lewis complained that if he even mentioned like publication to Tolkien would get all, he'd in a frenzy, he'd like start another revision on his books. And as a side note, Tolkien is responsible for C.S. Lewis's conversion from atheism to belief, even though they're not in the same, Tolkien and Lewis are not in the same church. He is responsible for his belief in the first place, so Tolkien gets a lot of credit for C.S. Lewis's writings, and he should. But at the same time, I think Lewis doesn't get enough credit for Tolkien's writings because Lewis was really the one person at that time period who believed in Tolkien's stories. Like, Tolkien had some critical work that was acclaimed, but at the time, nobody took his Hobbit stories seriously. He was ridiculed for them. And Lewis was the one who really believed that they had potential to be great, to be published. And was always very encouraging in that respect. The favor wasn't really returned because Tolkien was very, very critical of Lewis's writings and didn't approve of his style. And again, I talked about that in my last video, and I think that although he criticized Lewis maybe a little too harshly, in my opinion, I think that where he was coming from was right. When you're thinking about fiction as an art form and how it's going to be effective. And if you think about this, I think it makes sense in every part of your life, and in every art form and how you approach it. You're going to produce the best work if you care about it for the sake of the work and not the means that you hope to accomplish. I think we can understand that, and yet we often have this problem. It's really frustrating, to be just really blunt. If you look at most religious writers who were known for their religious writing and they tried to write fiction, it's usually garbage. It's crap because they have this mindset of using fiction for this means of telling their moral, and the result is that their fiction is terrible because they don't care about it as an art form. They're just using it, and it's just such a wrong mindset. We don't approach other things that way because we know that that's not how they work. And I think these writers just think that they have to push what they're talking about, or nobody will know where they're coming from. Tolkien didn't do that, and yet we see such genuine goodness in his stories and such high morals and heroism and courage and love told in ways that are so much better than any of these inferior writings. And he wasn't really trying to do that. I think it's just who he was. These stories are what he imagined. They're what he was passionate about. He cared about writing. He cared about writing well. And then the other things just came in because of who he was as a person. He had high moral standards. He had strong beliefs. He didn't have to push those things into his fiction for them to come through because writing fiction is writing a part of yourself. And that is who he was. And who he was comes through, and it comes through so much more beautifully than if he had pushed it and tortured it and tried to stuff his writings full of metaphor and morals. And again, I think so many writers could learn from that, learn from him, to learn to respect art forms for what they are and not just as tools to accomplish a means. And so, yeah, I think that's why Tolkien's writing is more effective, and it also reaches a much larger audience because it appeals to people on all kinds of different levels. It's adventure, it's fantasy, it's just all kinds of fun stuff. There's humor, there's just beautiful descriptions. You read some of those descriptions of the men going into battle and the kind of just this glory of heroism. But then it's also a story about just home and the smallest people in the world doing the greatest things. And it can sound very basic, but I think it's also important to remember that the greatest stories in the world are the most basic ones told greatly. And that's really what Tolkien does. He tells simple stories on a grand, beautiful scale. He puts a lot of the love of home into these wild adventures. He's inspired so many thousands of stories. Again, these books deserve to be classics. They deserve the place of honor that they get. People complain about them being overrated. They complain about everything being compared to them. But there's a reason for that. And I think while I appreciate George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis, Tolkien had the best approach. Again, he's not perfect, but his approach to writing, his appreciation of literature for its own sake, is really beautiful. And again, if you care about good things, that's going to show in your writing. You don't have to worry about pushing it in there. So those are my thoughts about Tolkien, Lewis, and MacDonald. I respect people who have the opposite opinions and think maybe George MacDonald is the best or C.S. Lewis. It's really just a matter of opinion and what you think fiction should be trying to do and what you want out of it. But yeah, I think it's a super interesting discussion. I think the relationships between these guys are super interesting. If you want to read about that, it's just really fun. They had a club called the Inklings, where they would get together and read their drafts together, which is so fun. It just sounds like they had a great time with it, which is also really neat. But anyway, yeah, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were good friends. They had some differences of opinion, some very strong differences of opinion. They had some falling out over the years, but they always had a strong mutual respect for each other, and we really do owe the works of the one to the other. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this series. I hope some of this at least is interesting to you. Again, these are just my opinions and thoughts on some of these books and authors. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.